All right, everyone. Without any further ado, as far as I'm aware, the rules of debating haven't changed since last round, so speaking times are still 7 minutes. There won't be belled, or I'll put timestamps in the chat at 1, 6, and 7. And if I forget, I apologise. So it is important to please time other speeches and time yourselves. Other than that, the motion before the House today reads as follows. In times of economic crisis, this House will implement fiscal central banking. Without any further ado, let's invite the Prime Minister to begin the debate. Here. Oh, one last thing, sorry, as well. For POIs, we'll assume POIs in the chat. If you have a specific preference for how you'd like them asked, please do so before you start your speech.
All right, perfecto. There we go. Panel, the question of this debate is a very, very fundamental clear comparative. Who is better at managing you out of a crisis? Is it the government, democratically elected, or is it central banks? Before that, though, why is this right, and why should this be the only thing which you should care about in this debate? Because there are principles of, oh, people should have a right about deciding how we get out of a crisis, all these kinds of things. Two things on this note. One, the preferences, RE, how you want the state to act in relation to the economy as a voter, are outcome oriented. You want to keep your job. You want there to be general growth. And crucially then, they are genuinely obvious. No one wants to, like, say, destroy the economy. And if they do, we say that's illegitimate because there's future people who will suffer. So that's not even a legitimate preference. All the legitimate preferences are very, very obvious. What isn't obvious is how voters can understand the processes through which to get there. Most voters don't know which things most things like most economic tools and fiscal tools are within society, how the stock market works, all these kinds of things, which are all very fundamental to how you get growth post-recession. They often don't even know the crises or what caused a certain recession, therefore how to address it. Meaning, crucially, they have a knowledge of their outcomes, and we can very easily determine that, but they don't know the processes. So we should defer to the people who will achieve that outcome. But secondly, if these preferences are important in and of themselves, we say that is only because it's about controlling of your own life. The state represses you, you should be able to control your own life, you should have agency to live the good life, that kind of bullshit. Crucially then, if this is true, what is more important is the functioning of economy in and of itself. Because without a functioning economy, you have no job, you have no money to buy anything you want. Your agency is continually deprived from you each and every day. But also, just look like no food on the table, no heating in your home, when you can't provide for your family, it obviously goes directly against the good life in and of itself, and therefore is more important. Yeah, what's your clarification, CO?
So how would you define when the crisis has begun, when the crisis has ended? What are the metrics, and who will decide this?
People just kind of know globally. Like, it's kind of obvious that 2008 was a big financial crisis because a bunch of jobs went poop and like GDPs crashed suddenly, but then they start to return and it seems like a relatively stable up. That's when it probably goes back in charge. I think it's going to be very obvious about this. Plus, the kind of way the motion just works is that it's only in times of crisis. So we just have motion fiat and I don't care. Right. Why are governments bad at managing the economy in times of crisis? Note that this comparative only changes in instances where central banks are independent, because if not, it doesn't matter. So that's the context which is crucial. But also, there's a clear comparative between what governments want and why they don't just listen to central banks and economic advice and all this stuff. The reasons for that are going to be the comparative for why they're worse now. One, note things like populism within governments, so within crises. So when people have lost a bunch of jobs or there's fear of losing jobs, people get very, very threatened by that prospect. They crucially don't want to lose things like hope, so they go advocate for big solutions like Erdoganics currently in Turkey post a huge inflationary spiral crisis in recent years, but also just there's no acceptance of a hard solution, right? You as a voter do not want to vote away your own job or vote away your ability to live the current life you are living. It's a huge barrier to you. So you defer to the people who are promising you snake oil, right? Who say, we don't have to do that. We don't have to implement austerity. We don't have to go things. We can spend our way out of this current inflation stay right now in status quo. Crucially then, this is also why you don't get things in opposition like, oh, well now if you limit their spending, then it's going to keep spending on the military, but cut the benefits. No, because things like benefits are very, very populistic and the things will be inherent in the last things to go. But crucially then, past that, central banks in and of themselves are often tenured people who are independent. Therefore, they don't care about deferring to the populace. They care about doing their job, which they find huge purpose and meaning in life is. They want to make sure that it's well managed. They won't defer to populism and therefore are unlikely to put in drastic, over-the-top, unrealistic solutions. Secondly then, short-termism within government. No, you have frequent elections of government. At most, it's things like every 5 years. Crucially then, often things like economic growth or these steps for how well it's going to manage into the future don't come around every 5 years. But even when they do, your election may be 1 year, maybe 2 years, the way it happens to fall in relation to the crisis. And the kinds of way that the more austerity politics, the more kind of correct policies, which will help you grow out of certain things or help you avoid further inflation or stagnation, are often things which don't have immediate results. You need to defer to things which have immediate results, which can have drastic long-term results in government, which can often lead to things like you borrow more and more and more to ever avoid having to do austerity. Then you end up with things like Sri Lanka with a huge debt bubble. Then when another crisis comes along with COVID, they can't pay back any of those debts, and then the debt bubble pops, and now their entire economy is fucked and the country has gone bankrupt. But crucially then, the central bank in and of itself is independent, and you are tenured oftentimes, so you don't care about your short-term selection. You're already in the job, you're grand going into the future. Sure, some people may want promotions, but that's done internally, and the people at the top are secure in their job. 3, the governments are themselves ideological rather than pragmatic. That is to say, you often have left-wing governments who presume the general way you should treat economics is, say, Keynesian, or right-wing who go Hayek. These idea that you just have broad strokes within different ideologies of different parties because that's what they advocated on, and therefore they're in themselves indoctrinized into it. Note that yes, there is an ideology within central banks across the world. This is true. If you want to respond with this, it's true. The ideology is pragmatism. Why is this the case? Because crucially, things like economics, because it wants to establish itself as a very legitimate social science within broader universities, claims to be scientific. It has to defer constantly to data and facts. It's because of this, then, it defers to studies. In some instances, based on the context, Hayek is right and sometimes Keynes is right. Because of that, then, you defer to them and you are constantly pragmatic as the very nature of your ideology in of itself. What does all of this mean for the debate then? It means, therefore, governments are far more likely to mismanage, to have things like huge debt buildups, inflation spiraling into the future, preventing you from ever recovering again, or just doing drastic moves which don't work, things like Abenomics, which actually aren't really helping in Japan right now, rather lead into continuing stagflation. All these kind of solutions, which seem like simple, obvious solutions, don't work, and economists know they don't work, but they get crowded out. Or you often get things on the gray zone where they may work, but people aren't really sure, but economists don't want to risk them. We say, yes, sure, sometimes you get the risk, but oftentimes those risks don't pay off. We ought to defer to the known solutions, and those are the ones that the solutions which economists will defer to, therefore we get better management. Do closing opposition have a POI or opening opposition? I don't really give a fuck. Grand, so I guess you don't. Right, why are central banks then really fucking good at this? Apart from the obvious analysis that I've already done on how they don't do all the bad things and are more likely to do things in a good way, there's other things. Not that we would say that we have a burden here to say that not necessarily a burden, but we want to prove, just to make sure like CG can't do anything, that you have sufficient control here to guide yourselves out of a crisis as a central bank. Because yes, you can't just determine where the distribution of things go, but things like inflation, things like growth and these kinds of things actually are often more determined by things like monetary supply and the degree to which how quickly that money spreads across through an economy, the concept of velocity for money, right? Crucially, things like money supply, it's obvious how it affects inflation, right? Because the more money that is within an economy, the more goods, the more there is for the same amount of goods, and therefore the prices change. But crucially then, velocity is something you control via tax, which is part of the motion. So if say the government overspends in one area but not enough, and you didn't get to control that distribution, you can tax very specifically to make sure money spreads to areas that need growth, or don't spread too much, or don't the overinflated growths where they put too much money distributed into, you can heavily limit and tax to make sure you don't get inflationary spirals in certain industries. I mean, crucially, you're able to sufficiently control every single aspect of your industry and your economy to guide yourselves out of this crisis. But B, note if even if all this isn't true, and this is a really good mech because it just sets up the whole debate, is ultimately things like IMF loans, like multinational corporations and just big corporations in your own country, they have economic advisors who probably went to the same schools and colleges, follow the same consensuses as the economists within central banks. And therefore, if they perceive it as better management, or if they just believe there will be better management going into the future, you get more confidence, you get more loans, you get more money to get out of these crises, and you get more investment to get out, grow. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to invite the opposition leader to begin the case for the opposition bench. Here.
Okay, cool. I'll take POIs in chat. Let's take a look at Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s, what is otherwise known as the lost decade. This is a situation when people who were not part of the government, who were not part of the voting public, thought that they knew better. The IMF came in and said that austerity was the only way to go. The policies that they forced the government to enact worsened poverty, worsened inequality, and halted the industrialization that could have spurred further growth. This is the lost decade we don't want to lose anymore. Note what type of debate this is, because we think there are a range of situations in which governments are going to have different different responses. In situations where the government agrees they are going to need money from other sources because they have mismanaged their own money and they can't print their own money without causing huge amounts of inflation, there are going to be cases where the government wants to spend less in order to get a loan from the IMF if they think that the IMF's conditions are going to be fair and are going to lead to future growth. In these situations, this is not part of the round, because if the government wants to spend less and the central bank wants them to spend more, just because the central bank increases your budget doesn't mean you force the government to spend more. So this debate is uniquely about the situations where the government wants to spend more and the central bank is cutting your budget and stopping you from doing that. Why do we think this is so important? Because we think in situations where the economic crisis is not because of mismanagement, we think in this situation, the government still has a huge amount of credibility in being able to decide how to chart the best way out of it, right? In cases where there has been like huge amounts of mismanagement and corruption, these are situations where governments are probably going to have to get money from the IMF because any sort of investors have found out about the corruption and no longer want to invest in your country. You have to go to the IMF, you have to go to things like austerity. But in situations where it is not the government's fault, it has happened due to something like COVID, it has happened due to something like an insane volatile shock in like a natural resource. These are situations where the government can still be responsible with the type of money it is using and should still be able to make decisions on how to climb out of an economic crisis. Two arguments then coming out of OO. Firstly, on why we think it is important to balance the incentives of the central bank and the government and why we uniquely are able to ensure that people are able to get stimulus or investment when they need to. And secondly, why you think on their side of the house, they are more likely to get the politicization of the central bank. Firstly, let's characterize what the government's incentives are. We think, as stated earlier, these are situations where the government wants to spend, where people desperately need things like handouts and stimulus, and the government, obviously not wanting to, get trashed by voters and trashed by the media, wants to give those voters a hand. What are the incentives then of the central bank? We think firstly, they tend to be like highly bank and business friendly because firstly, there tends to be a revolving door between the types of people who work in the central bank and the types of people who then tend to retire and go work for those banks. So you don't want to be the person who's very bank or business unfriendly. And secondly, are like rebutting directly OG stuff about how like there's this academic bubble about how like economics is a science and so they have to be like super rational about it. Firstly, note that it's not like economics has a track record of being like a great science that always predicts the right outcome. Like economics for a large part of history has relied on this idea of like modeling the human being as a rational person who makes all the right decisions. It was only fairly recently like that like behavioral economics started to make its way into the field and we were able to make better decisions. The idea that just because you're an academic and have an incentive to be right doesn't mean that you actually are right. We think secondly, if you think about the incentives that you actually get in academia, where you want to, for example, agree with whoever is higher up in your faculty so that those are the people who give you tenure later, you are actually encouraged to only publish and only support a certain model of economics in order to actually get those tenure positions, in order to work your way up and eventually do things like work for the central bank. So as a result, we don't think they get the diversity of ideas that they wanted to talk about on their side of the house. Now, note this, we are happy for the central bank to have some power and to still be able to do things like control the interest rate, right? In cases where it's not an economic crisis, they are doing just objectively good things like lower employment and lower inflation. We're probably happy to let them do that. The risk of them screwing it up is not going to worsen a crisis. If they do screw it up, it's minor and they can correct course. But in these situations, we think it is a terrible idea to put all your eggs in one basket when the risk is so high when you are in a situation of an economic crisis. So why exactly do we think it is important to balance the central bank's interest? One, because we think it is more important for the government to be able to do things like give out stimulus instead of do things like lower the interest rate. Because we think for the average person, their ability to borrow in an economic crisis is so low that lowering the interest rate really does nothing to help them. What they actually need is direct stimulus and cash payouts, right? But super low interest rates are actually really good for like banks and companies who are then able to borrow more, right? We think in these situations, the central bank doesn't want handouts because handouts will cause an increase in inflation. There's just more money circulating, but a lower interest rate will also cause inflation. This is probably too much inflation for the central bank to take care of, and so they don't want that. So this is the way that the two actors in this motion are able to check each other. With fiscal central banking, we think the central bank is able to squeeze the budget to prevent the government from doing things like giving out stimulus and allow them to lower the interest rate like crazy to help banks and business. But on our side of the house, in the counterfactual, if there is no fiscal like central banking, governments are able to make that decision to give out stimulus and handouts when appropriate. Also note that we think in some cases where the government has not mismanaged their money and are doing things like investing in industrialization, particularly in developing countries, it is probably a good idea for the government to do things like continue to spend on manufacturing, continue to reassure investors that their like land and their manufacturing is not going to like go to shit and it's not going to be like taken away by the government. It is important that you're able to maintain your investing so that like the value of your property and the value of your machinery does not go down due to neglect. That is spending that is critical. That is spending that, as they say themselves, the central bank is probably not going to want to do, and it's probably going to tax like crazy. In these situations, you hamstring the government from being able to do essential things. This is critical. Why is this? Because firstly, we think giving direct stimulus mitigates the worst types of suffering that people are likely to exist on their side of the house, when people cannot pay for rent, cannot pay for utilities, cannot feed their families. Additionally, this prevents people from having to like dig into critical savings and like mess up the compounding investment that allows them to retire comfortably later. And lastly, we think like this can just be good. When people have more money to spend, businesses can make more money, unemployment goes down. These are all great things and can actually help you crawl out of a recession. But before moving on, I'll take CG.
Just as the info slide specifies, how you distribute the money, whether the government decides there should be stimulus checks or not, is dependent on the government. This does not change under the motion.
Yes, but you are able to do things like shrink the budget so that the government has to spend most of its budget on like running essential services like healthcare, so it doesn't have the extra money to do things like handout. So there are indirect ways that the central bank can influence what the government is spending on. For example, taxing things like projects that are related to industrialization, if that's the government's way of like developing its economy. Second argument then on the politicization of the central bank. We think first this leads to governments feeling useless because they can't pass the policies that they justifiably feel like they should be able to pass. And secondly, because people aren't able to do things like get stimulus checks because they see the government spending less and less money on them, people start to hate the central bank. What does this lead to? We think this leads to people feeling like it is justified to politicize the central bank because they perceive it as an evil, undemocratic force working against them. We think in weaker democracies this is particularly bad because governments now have an increased incentive to capture these banks, especially considering it is really, really hard to tell when you have stopped being in an economic crisis, once you actually have hit recovery rates. And it is hard to say, actually, we might think we've recovered, but we're going to dip into an economic crisis in the future. So central banks actually, and especially in cases where regulation is weak, be able to extend the duration for which they are able to have control over fiscal central banking. So governments have a huge incentive to try to capture the central bank. This means that the politicization you get of who gets appointed to be like the central bank commissioner becomes a far more politicized process. Any of their good benefits about having like good scientific economists running the central bank then go down the drain. This is an impact that doesn't just occur during recession, but happens all the time. We are very, very proud to oppose on OO.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government. Here.
Please give me one moment to gather my notes. Firstly, just a direct response up top as to why we think austerity tends to be better. Firstly, it provides a certain path towards recovery, which is to say, on the comparative, if you increase spending in times of crisis, you're by definition propping up more bubbles, which introduces more risk into the economy, and that risk tends to grow. In some circumstances, you can fix that later on down the line, but it's inherently speculative and is reliant on external factors over which you might not have control. You have a guaranteed path towards stability in our side of the house. Secondly, we've already proved to you that independent of whether it is or isn't actually efficacious, the conception of it by institutions like MNCs is that austerity is the best way to get a path towards economic recovery, which means you don't get capital flight, but also means you get investment into your economy while it's on the downturn, while it's a useful investment. Overall, then, I think even in the instances where it might not be the most effective solution, we also think central banks are likely to be pragmatic about these kinds of things. So they might not always defer to austerity, as I'm going to explain later. Second thing I want to say then, in terms of response to opening up positions at the top before I deal with integrated responses, is that their only response to the idea of governments being short-termist is the idea that, but you don't want to preside over an economic failure in the long term because you'll doom your party. The problem here is on the comparative. By definition, they have the fear on their side, or like on their side of the house, if they don't have central banks controlling things, that they will be held responsible for negative things and be kicked out of power now. They always have more ability to control the narrative, to implement, I don't know, white elephant policies or whatever, when they are still in power, to hedge against the kinds of risks that they talk about, or just believe that they'll fix it at some point in the future. By definition, you just want to win the next election because that is the prerequisite for getting incumbency bias and that kind of things to move forward into the future. So moving on then. First part of the case, no response to the principle. I'm going to move on from them. Second part of the case, the political climate in times of economic crisis. We explained to you that because of populistic narratives that particularly emerge in times of economic crisis, specifically when people are looking for large-scale solutions, governments have the incentive to provide that. And even if they don't, they oftentimes get voted out and introduced to people who want to have these large-scale solutions. These are not efficacious solutions, and they introduce a huge amount of risk into the economy. Things like massive spending programs to try and release yourself out of crisis, increasing the debt bubbles that can pop further into the future, which means that the crisis in the future will be much, much bigger insofar as that doesn't happen. The response we hear to this is that, but it only matters in these specific instances. A couple of things on this. Firstly, I just think that you have an increased ability as a government to be able to scapegoat these institutions when they have more power, which is to say, if governments want to spend less, oftentimes they don't have the capacity to do it because of the populist incentives we just outlined there. We give them increased capacity to want to spend less on our side of the house when they can engage in these kind of pragmatic solutions. But also secondly, in terms of like scapegoating, I've dealt with that there. Secondly, in terms of short-termism, this means that you need to do more things to try to fix the crisis immediately, but oftentimes these things take a long time to accrue. You could, if in 1 or 2 years' time, call a snap election, etc., and that'd be really bad. Thirdly, in terms of ideology, we'd explain to you that they're more variable in terms of their ideology, which means they can not only have a couple of different solutions for a couple of different economists, but also just in general, you can have a different solution for different crises. So, for example, in 2008, it would have been a bad idea for Ireland to, like raise its corporation tax because it would have had capital flight, but Germany could raise their corporation tax and still because the industries were more settled in that area and therefore they wouldn't leave, right? So that's the kind of thing you can have on our side of the house that they can't have in theirs because they need to defer to the ideology of the governments in power. So the comparison then is in terms of the quality of central banks in and of themselves versus the governmental institutions. What we hear in opening opposition on this is the idea that central banks are themselves dogmatic, which is to say that you want to get a certain kind of promotion, so you defer to the kind of dogmatic or understanding of economics. We explained to you that economics is evidence-based, and so the idea from opening opposition that there's a track record issue there doesn't really interact with our case. We would say that that track record is getting better over the course of the future, and indeed you just have to defer to evidence in order to prove things, which is to say, even if I am an up-and-coming economist and I can show through evidence that a certain kind of dogmatism is wrong, that's oftentimes how you do get things like publicization, because it's a large-scale thing that gets picked up by newspapers and like academic textbooks, sociologists and other industries as well. So you can oftentimes get that kind of diversification there. I also like to note, just in terms of general privilege, it's easier to become a central banker than it is to become a politician, because it's relying on having a track record within economics, which is to say generally to do with things like merit, although not always, compared to a government which is oftentimes bound up in social biases. The response we hear to this is the idea that, but you need to have checks and balances within these sort of instances. Here's the thing on checks and balances. That is only the case if there's a harmony there, which is to say, in instances where the central bank and the government have a relative degree of similarity in how they understand the crisis and how they want to interact with it. In instances where it's disharmonious is where the debate lies. In these instances, it's unclear if these function as good checks and balances, or as we would contend, they are acting oppositionally towards each other. Because we would propose to you that having fiscal and monetary policy working in tandem with one another is the way in which you can get these kinds of crises to solve, by doing the things that we talked about in opening government. Things like, if your government is doing a certain thing, you're able to do like increase the velocity of money within the economy to make sure that the spending happens, even if the government's social policies are different. So the ability to get checks and balances is increased in our side of the house because you have some degree of control over the governments at the at the expense of the abilities for governments and central banks to be oppositional towards each other on the ground. I'm going to take a point of information from either team. I'm opening first. Closing.
Let me qualify the QI from earlier. If you distrust government so much, why will the central bank ever declare the crisis over and return power to a government it does not trust?
So I think that firstly, I just think we have some degree of fiat to determine when a crisis ends or not, it doesn't end. But also insofar, don't you ever prove whether central banks are the actors who can determine when this crisis ends? I think you're more likely to defer to evidence-based things, that kind of thing. Also, central bankers probably don't want a huge amount of political power for the reasons that we outlined. They chose to not go into politics, to go into the kind of things to help people out. Oftentimes governments will have the power to decide when the crisis ends, but of course that in those instances that would be non-comparative if they were to call it early. I don't think that claim is going to win the debate in any meaningful sense. Let's talk about the politicization of central banks then, just very briefly. The first thing to say is it's unclear what the delta increase in incentive is in opening opposition, which is to say, on their side of the house, because central banks have still control over monetary policy, like on either side of the house, they have that degree of control. If there was an incentive for governments to capture them, I think that incentive is already existent in their current place. But also, insofar as you don't want to ruin your reputation on the international stage to get things like IMF loans, IMFs, like the IMF and other, like World Bank and other institutions, want to have a strong central bank in that area for stability, as you mentioned previously. So there's a limit to the degree to which you're likely to engage in that kind of thing on the international stage. If there's a delta there, we say it's extraordinarily marginal and it doesn't impact the rest of the things in the debate we talked about. So what is the weighing for our case and why is it going to win? We provide to you a clear solution for the path towards recovery and crisis, having flexibility, but also a clear vision in terms of how you're going to do that. In terms of scale, that obviously impacts everyone within an economy and provides a trajectory going forward into the future, so it helps out future actors. But also in terms of vulnerability, we would contend to you that in times of economic crisis, those who are the worst off tend to be the ones who will lose their jobs first, will come under the brunt of things, that kind of thing. Also, social problems tend to increase in times of economic crisis as people seek someone to blame. You get increased scapegoating and populism, etc. Therefore, the most salient impact in this debate is who can provide the most guaranteed solution towards times of economic recovery, which we provide to you by opening government, by providing you a degree of stability in these kinds of processes and the degree where central banks are good actors to engage in these kinds of things. Therefore, you should propose this motion.
Thank you very much for that speech, DPM. I will pause the recording now for the DLO. Recording is back on for the DLO. Kick it off whenever you're ready.
So OG runs quite an esoteric case, but I think fails in having a clear vision for actually how they solve the crisis. I'm going to start with 2 different observations about their case, then 3 clashes. So first observation, as OG claims on both sides of this debate, central bankers use tools like raising interest rates, using QE, using helicopter money in order to remedy the crisis. The question is, does conflating these different mandates affect the capacity of central banks to alleviate the crisis in the first place? That is how you're going to adjudicate this debate. Secondly, OG says there's a principle here. People don't have a right to dictate how certain economic measures are employed. Firstly, they say that it's an illegitimate preference if you have a preference to take actions which damage the economy. Response, the point of a reparative obligation is that because everyone individually has a subjective good, the state has an obligation to maximize the amount of maximize your specific autonomy, which means this is the reason specifically we allow individuals to influence government policy, especially since the types of policies that governments are instituting are often more proximate to individuals. We do not have the epistemic capacity to assert that any one individual's preferences are illegitimate. 2, I'd contend further that it's not that people don't want economic growth, it's just that people have different visions for how they want the government to aid them during crises. Given that is the case, this assertion that people have illegitimate preferences does not work. Finally, they say that people need to be productive in order to agitate. But if anything, people will vote for things like getting handouts, getting food, the examples that they talk about. But as we suggest on opening opposition, central banks have enormous incentives to override those sorts of things just for the sake of overall generalized economic growth. The conclusion of this rebuttal is that inasmuch as they reduce the democratic will of individuals, this flips OG's principle affirmatively because it shows that you unjustly stunt individuals' democratic will, that coercion is unjustified, that we have a reparative obligation to maximize individuals' agency in influencing their governments. Now, why do we suggest that instituting this policy reduces the capacity of the central bank to address the crisis? There are 2 different things I want to note. One, there's a literal inability of the central bank to do traditional monetary policy when you institute fiscal central banking. For instance, when central banks prioritize setting a budget, that could potentially conflict with other ways they want to stimulate demand within the economy. And the reason that this conflict is harmful is because they need to figure out how to balance minimizing unemployment, which you get from increasing demand, and keeping inflation in check. It is much harder to do that when the central bank often has things like dual mandates, a la the Fed, where they are required to control inflation, but they don't have a mandate to do things like reduce inequality, which means they might prioritize one over the other, so OG does not get their benefits. DPM says there's no check and balancing, but the point is, functionally, these different bodies serve different purposes. The government serves the purpose of reducing things like inequality, increasing things like jobs, ensuring people have food on the table, which is what we've told you from first. Whereas the central bank should be more focused on things like rates, on things like inflation. Secondly, people now perceive enormous amounts of uncertainty on the part of the central bank for the reason that, given that this policy is so unprecedented, there's going to be huge amounts of media scrutiny on this policy, meaning that people are going to react in a highly, highly controversial way. Why is this terrible? Since tools of monetary policy are quite blunt, people don't know what central banks will prioritize. And the reason this is harmful is because one of the main powers of the central bank is its signaling power. People need to signal where the economy should be heading. But because the central bank has so many different priorities now, investors perceive that the central bank is going to make unstable decisions and preemptively pull out. Now, they say that MNCs support austerity. This is pathologically false for the reason that MNCs and the IMF have disavowed austerity since crises like those in Greece, and it's within the public consciousness, it's more proximate to people now. So the endpoint of this analysis is that only under our side do we make recovering from a recession much, much faster, whereas on their side, it becomes harder, especially in contexts like Brazil, like Venezuela. The implication of this is we can still do the things that OG talks about, like prevent the inflationary spirals. However, the question then becomes, do central bankers have good incentives? We're not saying that they put in bad policies. We can accept that they see different ideas, we can accept that they look past evidence. Our claim is that they are more likely over the years to be overly pessimistic, overly insulated, and overly privileged for the reason that they're constantly looking at papers, they're constantly looking at the numbers that OG talks about, whereas the government constantly has to interact with their constituents, which means that the needs of their constituents are often more proximate and relative to them, meaning they do not prioritize things like inequality or unemployment during crises, which means people go without food. So if that's OG's metric, we're already winning. Before I move on, does CG have anything? Wonderful. Let's talk about government incentives for managing crises. I'm going to make 3 different responses to opening government. 1, they say populism happens. Populism gets worse on their side because their causal link is wrong. Often incumbent governments, when a crisis starts, are not very populist. But when you feel a central bank is controlling your life, is overtaking the government, is limiting your capacity to feed your family, that is when you create the conditions for discontentment and for populists to emerge. Because what do? Populists come to power on the explicit mandate of the central bank encroaching on individuals' lives, the central bank squashing the budget that the government has in order to feed people every day, which means if they are right that populists are so bad, more of them come to power, more of them implement unorthodox financial policies under their side, flipping their largest harm. Next, they say that governments are short-termist. This is untrue because parties rein you in. You often want to leave a legacy. You want to become a bureaucrat later. If you make poor decisions right now, you know that the opposing party is going to use it against you, which means you have an enormous game theoretic incentive not to institute terrible policies. Finally, they say that government officials are too worried about ideologies like pragmatism. They have policy advisors which can intuitively moderate these things. This means you can still ensure governments don't go crazy with their spending and moderate government behavior. They don't go so crazy that the IMF doesn't want to give you a loan anymore, but it also doesn't mean that you shrink the budget to nothing such that people don't have food on the table. Finally, let's talk about nation states' abilities to grapple with economic crises. What we told you from first is that governments need to continue spending on things like manufacturing. And recessions can set back decades of economic growth, but if you don't continue spending on development, you can't counteract the effect of recessions by creating more jobs within the economy. The DPM pushback to this is, there's no delta. Here's the problem. Now, when this unprecedented policy is implemented, that justifies the government, especially in areas where there are relatively low levels of central bank independence, a la Erdogan, cracking down on the central bank more, and on just a question of scale, reducing to a much greater extent the extent of central bank independence, which means the types of policies you get, the things like QE, the things like interest rates, are going to be much, much worse because now you don't get the balance that we talked about under our side. So the conclusion of this is that even for nation states, they're unable to develop, they're unable to respond, sets back tons of growth. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thank you to everyone on the top half. We'll now move into the closing half of the debate today. Closing government, I'll just double check. You guys said no to filming, is that right?
Yeah, not consenting.
Hi everyone, apologies for the long deliberation. It was quite a close debate, and we discussed literally every split in the debate, which I think is reflected in the closeness of the debate. It was also quite a high quality debate and quite interesting debate, so teams should be very happy with their performance. That said, a couple of things we should say in general feedback, so we'll do that first, then we'll do the result, and then we'll give the reasons for the result. So in terms of general feedback then, I think the first thing, this wasn't a massive problem during most of the debate, but there was at times, and that is with complicated economics motions, make sure you are trying to simplify things so that everyone can fully understand exactly what you're talking about with all the concepts. The second thing I think that was missing from this debate was a lot of this debate also has an area that wasn't explored around how governments are likely to respond when central banks make decisions to tighten budgets or increase spending or whatever. So I think a lot more discussion around the ways and what the likely response of government is, what things would they cut, what things would they fund, etc. This is, I think, at times asserted by teams that needed a lot more explanation as to why this would be the likely way it would be done from op teams. I think from gov teams as well, more could be done preemptively to explain where you think it's going to be done, to not give op teams, I guess, the first grab at characterizing how it would likely happen. I think the third thing is teams probably need to be a bit more careful to be, I guess, really building up the likelihood of the way actors are going to be acting. And the fourth thing is just with extensions, making sure it's really clear where things are actually distinct. And I think at times trying to make sure they are a bit more distinct, or the things that are distinct, why they're the things that win the debate. In terms of the result then, it ultimately wasn't a unanimous decision. There are a few splits in there. So what I'll do is to try and make it clear is I'll run through the final ranks and then I'll tell you where there were splits in the votes. So the final ranks are as follows. The first goes to opening government. The second goes to closing government. The third goes to opening opposition. And the fourth goes to closing opposition. Where were the splits? It was a 2-1 split on the top half with opening government beating OO. It was a 2-1 split on the off bench with OO beating CO. And it was a 2-1 split on the short diagonal with CG beating opening opposition. So I hope that made sense, but the final ranks were OG, CG, OO, CO. Let's run through that decision now and how we got to it the way we did. So what do we get from the opening government team coming first in the debate, particularly comparing them to their closing and in the debate? I think the first thing that opening government is able to do ahead of their opening is provide some pretty good incentives as to the way in which governments are likely to do policy pretty poorly in terms of being responsive to like people, short-termism, ideological claims, which all are likely to interrupt the process by which people are likely to, by which we should be making good decisions that actually solve crises. And we think this characterization is broadly able to stand throughout the whole debate. So even when teams like OO make counter proposals to that, to say that they would likely to consider people and likely to actually, electoral incentives mean they're likely to care about people more, doesn't guarantee they're likely to act in ways that are sensible or likely to resolve the crisis as it exists. When we compare that to central banks, I think they're able to suggest that like all the sort of incentives that lead governments to act badly are flipped on central banks. They're not responsive to public votes. They have tenure or at least are more long-term positions than what they are with elections. They don't necessarily have as much ideology, and to the extent they do, that ideology is more rooted in academia and more rooted, oh, we've got two ideas now, are more rooted in academia and more rooted in their attempt in like a more like technical approach to that. So even in cases where central banks may act in ways that are like not necessarily popular or not necessarily always going to act in the best way, we think opening government does a better job of proving that they are likely to act in a more preferable way to governments. That's particularly important because it also helps beat out their closing. We think the closing does add to this argument about why central banks are likely to be good. They talk about like the threat of jail and credentials, etc. I think the problem with that though is it's adding new reasons, but not necessarily adding better reasons, or we're not more compelled by what CG has to offer on this point than what opening government does overall. I think the last thing that opening government does well on this particular issue is talk about I guess a weighing of principles around like autonomy and around like representing what people want in the debate. And this also I think clashes particularly well with opening opposition's points on outcomes and agency in this clash. So I think what opening government is able to do quite cleverly is suggest that people don't have a strong principal right to decide like every element of that. What people most want is a fulfillment of end outcomes. And if whichever proposal is able to better guarantee those end outcomes is a proposal we ought value. So when OO talks about agency as being an important counterpoint and something that people actually care about, if that agency results in worse economic conditions, I think the clever analysis by OG suggests that worse economic conditions actually more infringes their autonomy and their agency and doesn't fulfill their ultimate objective of having a strong and safe economy. They're able to get around that as well, and it also helps shift this issue on the principle. The last thing, talking a bit more about CG and some more of their extension now in this split, we thought CG did add, I think, starts at least a very good point around why conflicting policy is so particularly harmful. I think the problem there is that like, they identify that they're likely to have different policy approaches, but all the analysis as to why those policy approaches are likely to be different are all based on opening government stuff around the different incentives and different ideologies. So while adding something, don't know if it adds a significant amount more to what government has already said there. And I think they also need to do, there's a lot more space to work in exactly why those things are likely to be particularly harmful as compared to just one party having control. And I think the other thing that makes this split particularly close, and I think this is particularly reflective took up a lot of time in the panel discussion, is the responsive material we hear from the whip speaker about why central banks are likely to care about poor people or low-income people a lot more because they're the backbone of the economy, etc. I think the reason why this narrows the margin and helps beat the op teams, and ultimately doesn't help beat the government teams, is it is just one element versus everything else you've already talked about. So it was hard to weigh that against all the material I've already covered. But secondly, we thought that the material around why central banks already have an incentive to do good policy, things like wanting to look good to the IMF for future loans, wanting to solve the crisis, wanting to follow academic procedure, etc., all probably provided enough good reasons as to why this would likely operate in ways that are good for the economy, that could include people who are low income and are a part of that economy already. So while a new and far more direct response, I think compared to everything else, ultimately not enough to make that full switch between the two teams, which is why opening government ends up taking it over closing government. Let's then talk about opening opposition then and why they come in where they do in the debate. So I think the problem with OO, and this is also a problem I think with both op teams, I think as president of OO, it does become more problematic with CO, is that I think OO rests a lot of its case on the idea that central banks are likely to operate this in bad ways, and that is likely to have consequences. But too much of that is framed around this idea that central banks are likely to do policies that people are unhappy with. It's likely to directly harm people, and it's likely to hurt people. So that I guess is that mechanism is used for their first claim around like negative outcomes, but it also helps through their latter claim around politicization of the central bank. Now people are likely to respond poorly to that. The problem with both these claims is that they all rely on then the central bank making a ruling and then the government executing that ruling in ways that are particularly unfavorable to the populace and in ways that sort of like create these harms in the first place. I think it is possible to prove the link they might force the governments into doing it this way, but it is never characterized that I think also the OG, I think in their speech, but most pertinently multiple POIs, points out the fact that the government ultimately decides how the central bank's wishes are enacted in terms of shrinking or enlarging the budget, which means that if the electoral incentives are to not harm people, or governments have the incentive to not harm people, then the governments are unlikely to operate this in ways that are particularly harmful to people, which undercuts all those mechanisms. But secondly, it's just never, I think, fully substantiated by OO, which means it's hard to credit the rest of their analysis that all largely flows from that initial idea. And I think the other responses that OG gives around like politicization, around the IMF pressure, the fact that they don't already in a status quo politicize the central banks when they have control of monetary policy, etc., all I think do enough to suggest that this politicization isn't going to be necessarily as big. But I think, to be fair to all teams, there was a lot more space to characterize government response in this debate, which kind of was just left over by the teams. The last thing then that I think, talking about opening opposition, is that they try and characterize the ways in which central banks are likely to be like less in tune with people's needs and the government is better in tune with that. I think the problem with both these arguments is they fall down at the question of if governments are more in tune with people's ideas, why is it necessarily going to be a better way to solve the crisis? Which both government benches are able to respond to with different levels of responsiveness about why governments are likely to be bad and why central banks are likely to be preferable, which is why it was then hard to place the OO above either of the government teams. Last thing then I want to talk about is the closing opposition extension in this debate. I think the first note I'd make about the closing opposition extension is that the attempts to characterize the types of policies, like the fact that the central banks don't consider certain amounts of data and don't have access to certain inputs, is interesting. I think can be made quite relevant in the debate. But the problem is that when we're talking just a lot about like infant mortality and I think hyperbolous examples like that, it does, I think, reduce a bit of the credibility of the argumentation. There's never proven why a government in response to the central bank with decreasing spending is going to, for want of better phrasing, like turn off the child mortality policy as its first choice, or that the cuts are likely to be so severe that is the only option the governments have left to do. So I think at that point then, that mechanism also is hurt in the debate from closing opposition. I think the second thing then is, again, with that mechanism falling, a lot of their stuff on the distrust of central banks, etc., being that it is relied upon people being angry as a consequence of the policy outcomes. Because that policy outcome gap isn't filled, it's hard to credit those outcomes too. But the second note I'd make on that is that even if that link is made, the outcome of distrust, while labeled differently and by claim to be a separate extension, is still the idea that as a consequence of this action, there will be a distrust of this policy outcome. So people being very angry and governments responding by like having interfering in central bank and taking over is quite similar to what OO already says around the politicization of the central bank. So as we were unable to credit that as a significantly greater extension. I think the best stuff we hear from closing position is the stuff around the check and balance. So it's important to have these two bodies operating in separate ways to curb the worst excesses of each other. I think the problem with this and why it's ultimately unsuccessful in the debate is a couple of things. I think the first is that while true they could be complementary to curb the worst excesses, it's all a question of like, are they likely to operate within the capacity of those worst excesses, which is, I think, something that government bench is able to already disprove by suggesting that central banks are likely to operate well and governments likely to operate badly. I think it also falls down to the CG stuff where they add around why being complementary is important in solving crises and actually operating in separate ways is likely to prolong that crisis, which means that that check and balance, while maybe useful in a non-crisis time, and particularly in a crisis time, is actually may not be the best way to go. All right. Sorry if that was a bit long. I hope I've covered most of the debate, or at least covered the stuff that was relevant to and factored into decision making. If you have any further questions or would like any feedback, please feel free to reach out to myself or either of the panelists. I can be best reached on Discord. I can't guarantee I'll respond soon because I've got to go away for meetings tonight, but I'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, thank you for a great round. Well done on the round, and best of luck for the rest of the tournament.
Thanks, OA. Thanks everyone for the round.
Thank you very much.
Would it be possible to get feedback now?
I can't stay, but if you'd like to speak to Adia or Offrey if they're still here, you're more than welcome to, but I've got to bounce off.
Yeah, if anyone can, we'd be grateful. Thank you.
In terms of separately, should we message for feedback, or no? You're just probably too busy seeing and us having work.
No, please do message me. I'll probably just be later tonight or tomorrow morning. I'll get back to you. So just hit me up on Discord.
Just
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Could we know who split for us?
Yeah. So I think all the splits were Offrey splitting from Adia and I. Is that correct, Adia? Or no? Sorry, Offrey split on the top half and the off bench, and then Adia split on the short diagonal. Is that right, Adia? I'm not sure where Adia's gone. That's my recollection of what happened.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Is CEO still in the room? Yeah,
Hello.
CEO, I got that message. I will try and do it myself, or otherwise I'll let the Orgcom know as well.
Thank you.
No worries. Thanks, everybody.